But you have to now assess if I'm 10 million times more evil than Hitler or Stalin or the combination. I can play the voicemail that accuses me of being 10 million times more evil than Hitler and Stalin. It's from a Canadian, too.
Well, just shows that Canadians can be just as nuts as any other nationality.
Hi, I'm Ed Whittingham, and you're listening to Energy versus Climate, the show where my co-host David Keefe, Sara Hastings-Simon, and I debate today's climate and energy challenges. On April 21st, the three of us recorded a live webinar with special guest Jason Donev of the University of Calgary. We titled the show The Nuclear Option, a Canadian reality check, because nuclear is having a moment globally, but the story here at home is a lot more complicated. It turned into a lively and wide-ranging conversation on costs, timelines, small modular reactors, and the deeper issue that keeps coming up with nuclear. The physics may be solved, but the politics and institutions are not. So without any further ado, here's the show.
So the question we're talking about today is, does nuclear work? It clearly does. But the real question is, does it work here in Canada? And so to help us unpack this and the Canadian reality, we're joined by Jason Donev. He's a professor of energy science and physics at the University of Calgary, and one of the clearest thinkers on energy systems that we have in the country. He also leads energyeducation.ca, which is the world's largest and most widely used energy resource for adults. And he's a reviewer for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change as well. Jason joining us from Calgary. Welcome to Energy versus Climate.
Thank you.
So let's dive right in. Jason, you've spent a lot of time thinking about energy systems at a fundamental level. So perhaps you can give us the quick version of your background and how you think about nuclear energy in the broader energy system.
I like the very catchy title of this podcast, Energy versus Climate. I am somebody who is passionately concerned about climate change, but also really believe that in order to live the way we would like to live, we need access to energy. So energy versus climate, why not have both? And the answer is because if we want to have both, it's going to be expensive, it's going to be inconvenient, and it's going to be actually really, really difficult to do both. I'm fond of saying that even if you think climate change is a big problem, it's probably a bigger problem than you think. So I got involved with nuclear power as somebody who was opposed to it, who did not think nuclear power was a good idea. I thought nuclear power was a very dangerous idea. And the more I found out about it, the more I realized that we need to be doing a lot more nuclear, along with doing a lot more solar and a lot more wind and a lot more everything else. There's climate change is just a really, really big problem. Nuclear is an interesting technology. The physics of it is interesting. The science of it is interesting. So I got into it because they wanted me to teach it. And like I said, I started off being very, very opposed. But the more I learned about it, the more I was like, no, we need to be doing this along with a lot of other things.
That makes me have a poll question regret. We could have done a poll question of how many people were opposed to nuclear power, let's say 20 years ago, but have changed their minds since.
It was one of the interesting things that happened after Fukushima, actually. The number of people some journalists specifically, George Monbiot comes readily to mind, who in the process of looking into what happened with Fukushima were like, wait a second, what do you mean that's it? This is as bad as it gets, and it was actually very, very little, but that isn't the story people wanted to tell. So I encourage people to have complicated thoughts and feelings about nuclear power because it is a complicated subject, which is why podcasts are better than, say, a meme about this sort of thing. Anyway, I interrupted. Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to ask you to help us establish the global context. How long have we as humans been using nuclear energy, and how widespread is it really around the world?
We've got an answer from a UChicago perspective because just a block away where I get my lunch is where it started.
Absolutely. Do you want to talk about Stag Field and Enrico Fermi?
Yeah, there's a beautiful sculpture. I even have in Canmore a little piece of Chicago Pile number 1, the very first system that released nuclear power. So yeah, it started at University of Chicago under the squash court with Enrico Fermi making the first chain reaction.
And I remember that piece, David, because you brought it when we went to see Oppenheimer. And it glowed in your pocket during the entire 3 hours.
And Argonne Lab, which many people know about as a national lab, it's this big national lab near here. The reason Argonne Lab was there, as far as I understand the history, is Chicago pile number one. They pulled out the control rods and saw the beginning of the chain reaction, but then there was no heat removal or anything. It was just to show the chain reaction would work. And then they wanted to build Chicago pile number two. And I guess they already thought it wasn't maybe the best idea to do it in downtown Chicago. So they went out in the woods somewhere, some drive away. And that's where Argonne is now.
And interestingly, Canada did the same thing. Not long later, at NRCan on Sussex Drive, right? Like in the actual NRCan building, we did a very similar graphite moderated reactor.
I didn't know that. Cool.
Yeah. So Canada, number two in nuclear energy. I mean, I always want to throw in the caveat of, when we're talking about nuclear energy, we are assuming that we are talking about when humans are deliberately causing nuclear reactions to happen. Every time you're using geothermal energy, we are using energy. Every time you're using solar energy, we are using nuclear energy. So a lot of the geothermal energy comes from nuclear. A lot of the solar energy comes from nuclear. Well, actually, almost all the solar energy comes from nuclear. But with geothermal, it's a little trickier. Not to split hairs here, because I know when people say nuclear energy, what they mean is what started with the Chicago pile. And after Enrico Fermi did the Chicago pile experiment, they had and it's kind of funny looking back at the history of this. They did this really, really amazing thing that was brand new technology. They did a long distance telephone call. So they actually called Washington, D.C. to say that this was a success, but they were worried people were listening in. So they had to come up with a code. So the Italian navigator has landed in the New World was the code that Conan used. And the response was, well, and how are the natives? And the answer was very friendly. And that was how the long distance phone call announced the Chicago pile number one that David's talking about.
That's fascinating.
So nuclear power is roughly as old as long distance telephone calls.
It brings in some sort of subterfuge into it as well, a cloak and dagger element.
Absolutely. And that carries on with the nuclear sector.
You've got to stop us nerding out, Ed, but I'm going to nerd out for one more second. I think one profoundly interesting thing is there's all sorts of really hard and terrifying things, and I think you undersold some of the downsides. We'll get to that in a minute. But I think what's interesting is you think about that very first pile, it's not, there was some fundamental facts you had to know, but in terms of the actual technology needed to do it, just stacking together chunks of graphite and chunks of ore, it's not obvious to me that you couldn't have done that 50 years earlier if you go back in time. I've wondered about that a lot. That is, there wasn't some big enabling technology. You had to have this knowledge, you need this particular spacing of graphite bricks and uranium chunks. But I would like some time to kind of go back and see, could you have done that 30 years earlier? What would have been missing? It's not clear. But it's just interesting because it gives you a sense of what's hard and easy.
The answer is 30 years, I'm not sure, but 50 years, no. Because you wouldn't have had the purity of graphite and you wouldn't have had the purity of uranium. Nuclear technology is really, really hard. And this is one of the things about it being so terrifying when people talk about things like, well, what about waste? What about nuclear weapons proliferation and so forth? It turns out that nuclear technology is very, very difficult. And that is both what makes it difficult to employ, but it's also what makes it difficult for it to just go completely catastrophically bad.
And when we're talking about nuclear energy, Jason, just that people, I think, use it synonymously and they think of its use in the power sector. Do we have many examples of it being used for industrial heat, either in Canada or elsewhere?
The quick answer is no. Broadly speaking, nuclear energy comes from the energy inside of the nucleus of an atom. That's why it's called nuclear energy. Physicists are terrible at naming things. I wanted to name my child number one. Fortunately, my wife overrode that. So when the energy comes from nucleus, we call it nuclear energy. If you split apart a nucleus, that's fission. If you join two nuclei together, that's fusion. That's what powers fusion powers the sun. Fission is what powers our nuclear reactors. You also have nuclei just spontaneously undergo a transformation. This is radioactive decay. This is your alpha, beta, gamma decay. And with that spontaneous transformation, alpha, beta, gamma, that kind of technology has a lot of industrial uses. Checking welds, treating cancer, diagnosing other issues. There's a lot of uses, but we don't use fission to create heat for for industrial processes. There's no fundamental physical reason we couldn't, but we tend to use it for electricity. And while some cogeneration, some heat has been proposed and looked at, it's very, very rarely gotten off the drawing board. But we do use nuclear technology a lot for industrial application, but not heat so much.
Got you. And sorry, the last scene-setting question, then we can get into is nuclear having a moment globally, and if that's the case, why? And then some of the challenges. Bringing it back to Canada, so we've had nuclear power generation in Canada for decades.
Yeah, roughly 60 years.
60 years in Ontario, New Brunswick, and so in Ontario of OPG, Ontario Power Generation, and Bruce Power. In New Brunswick, you have NB Power. And I think in Ontario, at least, each OPG and Bruce Power operating 8 reactors. Give us a sense of the Canadian record with nuclear power today. We obviously haven't had a major accident or scare. Some other jurisdictions have.
Yes, we have.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, unpack that.
Sure. Canada had the NRX and the NRU reactor at Chalk River, which is a couple-hour drive north of Chicago. And back in, I think it was 1952, we had a reactor accident, and there was the U.S. actually sent up part of their nuclear navy to help out, to help clean up and to help manage this. And it, as quite weirdly, Jimmy Carter was one of the people the U.S. nuclear navy sent up to Canada to help with this. And given that he is, I think, the longest living president in history, I think there's something to be said for, we need to be careful about how we talk about radiation, shortening people's lives and so forth, because while radiation is absolutely dangerous and should be treated carefully and thoughtfully, nuclear accidents don't mean what people think they mean. So when you have something like 3 Mile Island, Fukushima, less so Chernobyl, but with Fukushima and 3 Mile Island, what you have is a huge media discussion about nuclear power. But when you have something like Windscale or SL1, which are also nuclear accidents that have happened, they did not capture the public imagination in the same way. So SL1 was more deadly than Fukushima and 3 Mile Island combined, not Chernobyl. Chernobyl was much worse. But when you have the SL1 disaster in Idaho, which actually spread radioactive contamination all over the northwestern United States and southwestern Canada, which includes where I'm sitting right now, Alberta, there just wasn't nearly the public outcry. And I think it just has to do with like how the media is handling this, how people are responding to the media, and so forth. So Canada has had nuclear fallout. We've had a nuclear accident. What we have not had is the major story around things like Fukushima and 3 Mile Island, or Chernobyl for that matter. Which we can also
David, I know you've had stats around Fukushima and the relative radiation exposure that safety workers were exposed to in Fukushima relative to where they might be exposed to in other air and in other parts of the world.
Yeah, see if I can remember. The worst exposed couple people in Fukushima had a good fraction of a sievert, is my recollection, which would be equivalent, it's a test, equivalent to increasing your 30-year cancer rate by %. But I had that number memorized and I've lost it now.
Those numbers are not, I don't remember them exactly either, but those numbers are relatively close.
And that's the worst exposed people, to be clear. So which is kind of equivalent to a big diet change.
One stat that I like on that, though, is the, nuclear compared with coal, for example, has resulted in, I think it's like, 1% of the deaths per unit energy produced, something of that order of magnitude.
I think that might actually even be a little high.
Yeah, I sort of let's call it less than 1%.
Yeah,
I don't have the exact number in front of me, but I think that's, from the direct risk. And that old age one is funny because we like to joke. My grandfather actually is one of the scientists who built the high flux beam reactor at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. So he was with Fermi back in the day. Those are family lore. Pretty fun stuff. I've never told you about that, Jason. And we always like to joke that he lived to be in his 90s because he got just the right dose of radiation.
Hormesis.
while he was working back in the 50s. So
yeah, Jason. So how would you characterize the moment that nuclear is having globally? And then after that, we'll try to characterize what it's having here in Canada. But is it, and we talked about on this show, the huge expansion of nuclear power that's happening in China. Are there other markets that are growing? And, nuclear countries like France is the one that springs to mind amongst the Western democracies. Is it expanding its fleet, or is it growth really being driven in developing countries?
What I think we're seeing right now is that, and a number of people, I predicted this, but not because I'm smart. I predicted this because I was angry, and I made some offhand angry comments about 15 years ago that by 2025, climate change would be so obvious that you wouldn't need scientific training or special equipment to see it. And this now seems like I was prescient, and really what it was is I was ticked off at people denying climate change, back in 2010, which people still deny climate change, but now it's more a lukewarmer thing. What we're seeing is that people and governments and so forth are now taking climate change seriously. It's becoming personal. And this idea of, wait a second, this might affect me too, not just somebody somewhere else. And what we are seeing at the moment, I think, is a huge increase, a mushroom cloud, if you will, of interest in nuclear power as an option. And what we're seeing is a lot of conversation, and we are starting to see action. China, with a command economy, with a centrally planned command economy, China is able to implement nuclear in much, much faster ways than would ever be permitted in a place like France or Canada or the US or really anywhere in Europe. That kind of command economy allows for a growth in some place like China that would just be very, very difficult to happen in a democracy. What I would say is that in economies like China, where you can see rapid growth and rapid change, and it's not just nuclear, right? We're seeing this with solar. We saw this with hydro. We see this with wind. We see this with battery storage. When you're looking at the China command economy, people can just sit down and say, go, and then people scurry and do. And there's some advantages to that. There's some real disadvantages to that too. I'm not in favor of switching to a command economy, but there are advantages to a command economy. So I think the conversation is happening in a lot of places, which is not the same thing as reactors going on the grid. And unlike solar, unlike wind, but very much like hydro, there is a huge, huge, huge lead time between we are doing nuclear, we're going to do nuclear, and then you have to go through several elections before nuclear power is actually getting put on the grid. So this delay between the decision and everybody buying in and starting is, I don't know if it's a fundamental part of nuclear, but it is very much a part of nuclear. And one I'm not opposed to, but it does cause nuclear problems. So there are almost 40 countries that have committed to tripling nuclear power by 2050. And if you look at that compared to solar, over the course of the past 40 years, solar has gone up by more than a factor of 100,000, which is just mind-blowing. But if we look at nuclear doesn't need to go up by a factor of 100,000. Nuclear needs to go up by like a factor of 3 to making as serious a contribution to greening the grid and greening energy as needs to happen. And those conversations are happening. But I think there's a lot of distance between the conversations that are happening now and actual reactors getting built and being put on the grid. Did I take that too far afield from what you intended?
No, not at all. Not at all. And it's I've got a perfect follow-on question, if I can call my follow-on question perfect. The risk of hubris. We've got a long list of knocks. Oh, not too long. Let's say we've got about a half dozen list of knocks against nuclear energy that we're batting around by email prior to this show. I always put at the top of the list, it's not saying this is an order of priority, but it's long lead time technology. For whatever reason, it kind of just rolls off the tongue that way. So in Canada now, we do actually have a new nuclear plant that is under construction, the Darlington New Nuclear Project, the BWRX 300 megawatts. So could you compare and contrast the lead time required for that project in Canada and Ontario with a very established track record of building and operating nuclear assets to some of the new projects that are happening in China? You've said that it's faster, but by what magnitude?
the actual construction time doesn't really differ. I mean, China might be able to do like 20, 30% faster. I don't know actual numbers, but the actual construction is not what's different. What's different is duty to consult. What's different is public consultation, the regulatory framework, the impact assessment. That's where you're throwing 5 to 10 years on a Canadian project that China is able to do far more quickly. And that's where I get concerned. I regret to say that one of the things that I have predicted, because I like spouting off these predictions because nobody really listens to me. So when I, years later, I wind up being right. I'm like, hey, I said this before, and all the ones that I get wrong, I just don't repeat. But my prediction is that the next major nuclear accident is actually going to be in China, and I think it's going to be as a result of some of the speed at which their reactors were deployed. But China is looking at building more nuclear reactors in the next 20, 25 years than exist in the rest of the world combined, just within China. And I hope I'm wrong about the next accident. Well, there will be another nuclear accident. There just will be. Accidents do happen. And then the question becomes, with those accidents, how well has the engineering put safety into place around that? So going from we want to build a nuclear reactor to we have a nuclear reactor, between China and Canada, I would say it's about a factor of 2, but it's not construction that's doing it. It's a regulatory framework process. Did that answer the question?
Yes. And I'd love to turn to David and Sara to get their thoughts. So I'm just going to run through the others on our list of knocks against nuclear. It's capital intensive. Alternatives are cheaper. The waste remains an intractable problem. It requires state or nation level backstopping of insurance due to the liability risk, and it can lead to or feed the proliferation of nuclear weapons. So maybe turning to Sara first, if you want to cherry pick what you like from that list, which would you think is a fundamentally real concern or knock, and which are more contingent? So over to you, Sara.
Yeah, I'll go with sort of the ones I'm most worried about. I think they're all real concerns, as is, the idea that the only way to do it fast is by bypassing, consultation and the things that are obviously, let's not get into what China is doing, but are obviously the things that we need to be doing here in Canada. I'll say my biggest concerns about nuclear is not even necessarily about the technology itself, but the way that it is. And I think it's the perfect example of a technocratic solution that is put forward and amplified by some, not all. So I'm not saying that all people that are supporting nuclear have this view, but by some used as basically a delay on action to decarbonize in other ways.
Are you thinking Saskatchewan specifically?
No, I mean, I'm not even going to necessarily pick out specific regions. I think it's general. I don't think it's even Canada specific, right? But what I'll say is there is, the costs are relatively significant, and we're at a point where in the US and in Canada, I don't think you see this stuff being built without significant state support. And so then it's a question of, how much money do you put into nuclear versus other things? And how much is nuclear put forward as sort of, this is what we're going to do, and so we're going to do that instead of doing something else. And that is my biggest concern with nuclear. And I don't think that I'm just making this up. I think we see this playing out. So if you look at, I was reviewing a report just before the show called 8 Years on the Road, on the Roadmap, Assessing SMRs in Canada, which is by Susan O'Donnell and MB Ramana, who I actually had a chance to interview at one point. So they reminded us in this report that in 2018, Canada put out a roadmap. The first SMR was supposed to be operating in 2026. We've spent about $4.5 billion, billion with a B, in federal money on nuclear. I did a quick phone a friend before this and asked Blake Schaefer to give me the number of how much building a transmission line between Alberta and BC would cost. And it's about somewhere in the neighborhood of, $3 to $4 billion, probably a bit more once you have some overrun. So, comparable amounts. And so I think that, we need to be really honest about the ways that nuclear is being used by many to delay action on other types of policies and other types of efforts to decarbonize. And I also think the other big sort of error that I see is this argument around the cost reduction that we're going to see, right? And so there's a lot of talk, I think, about SMRs or this new solution. It's going to be so great because we can build lots of them and we can get the same kind of learning curve we've seen for solar. And Jason, you already, answered this by saying that we need to build out about 3 times the amount of nuclear that we have today in order to, decarbonize. And the whole magic of the learning curve is like orders of magnitude, not factors of 3. And so the idea that we're going to see, any amount of real cost reduction from some kind of scale up of nuclear in, again, let's talk about, say, the US and Canada, or even throw Europe in there. I think that is just completely false based on the amount that we're talking about. I think that it's in competition with other technologies for electrification. Certainly in Alberta, there's this big push of we could, use nuclear to decarbonize the oil sands. And I think my answer for that is once you have if you really believe that you had this great low cost source of low carbon energy, using it to then produce oil would be a very strange thing to do with it, right? So you're sort of, you've already solved the problem and now you've gone back into kind of back into the original issue. So I just don't see where we're at now with the prices of renewables, with the ability, the falling cost of batteries, the potential for transmission lines, and where I think the state should be focusing the bulk of its funds. I don't see that path forward. So maybe my answer to you, Ed, is a little bit, my biggest concern is really the economic one, with this subtext of, I think it's not only sort of somewhat foolish, but I think it's potentially harmful in how it is slowing or being used by some, again, as an element of climate delay. So I'll stop there after my bit of a nuclear rant, maybe if I have to. Although I'll say, it doesn't come from an anti-nuclear. Like I said, I'm the granddaughter of a nuclear physicist. So I certainly also we talked last time, Ed, about how I grew up learning about energy. I also grew up learning about the wonders of nuclear energy.
Sara, can I just trouble you to define how you're using technocratic? Because I've heard it used in different ways, and just if you could provide a definition for technocratic.
Sure. So I will attempt to, with the caveat that it's definitely not my area of expertise, but I'll say I'm using it here to describe the class of solutions to climate change that are focused primarily on a new technology will fix it, and it doesn't require us to grapple with broader societal and energy system questions around that. But rather, we can bring in this new technology and we can keep doing everything the same as we always were.
Like batteries are a new technology that we're bringing in to fix climate change.
I think technocratic is normally used in the phrase of things I don't like.
Well,
I'm teasing,
yes,
but I'm only teasing a bit. I think typically people have all these technologies they like that aren't technocratic, and the ones they don't like aren't. But
I think that is a somewhat fair point. Although I'll say if one feels that they're being accused that the technologies that or that their favorite solutions are technocratic, that also might say something about oneself. I will say that I think that, to me, integrating batteries and renewables goes along with changing the way that the energy system is designed, right? It goes towards a much more... Sure, you could do that with batteries without changing things, but most effectively is doing that in a way that's decentralizing energy, that's bringing in more demand side flexibility, that's changing ownership structures of renewable energy. So who's owning owning renewables and so forth. So it's sort of, are you really just taking one piece out and putting something in without having to change any of the rules or structures around it, which is more on the nuclear side, I would argue? Or are you actually having to confront, we need to change the amount of energy we're using or the ways that we're using it too.
It would be awesome. The quickest way to solve a problem is if you can just change one thing and everything changes. But nuclear power doesn't work that way. The costs are, frankly, a joke. A fair way to summarize it is, in the Western world, at least, we just do not know how to build reactors at a cost that's not a joke. We've unlearned. There's been some very nice analysis by some folks at Stanford, Jonathan Koomey et al., that looked at the costs of all the U.S. reactor fleet, because they were mostly public utilities, so we could see the costs. And people were building reactors at a reasonable price, and kind of $2,500 a kilowatt in current terms back in the day. But we've completely forgotten how to do that. So the actual costs of the completions in the Western world are, well over $10,000, up towards $20,000 a kW, which is just a joke. And nobody can really say clearly what fix would be needed to change that. It certainly isn't a learning curve. There are a bunch of complicated reasons why nuclear is so ridiculously expensive. It's clearly not kind of inherent to the technology, whatever that means, but it's also true that there's no obvious fix. Something would have to be very different. In terms of my concerns about nuclear, I think the central concern to me is that, lots of things are great in principle, but we just don't know a recipe to build nuclear plants at a reasonable cost in the West anyway. And China maybe is a different thing. I want to pick at a few things. I think there's been a lot of hype, especially in Canada and elsewhere, about small modulars. This is not a new idea. When I was first at MIT, the nuclear engineers were talking about modular reactors. There's certainly some basis there that could make sense, where if things were all manufactured if more of the big units were manufactured offsite in a production line. But the fact is, the SMRs that are actually coming to market are basically variants of existing light water reactors, and it's not at all obvious that they will be cheaper. Indeed, the people who I trust think that they will not be cheaper, but I think we don't know until it actually happens. I don't take the waste concern seriously. I think part of it is a lot of literature comes from the U.S., and the U.S. Managed nuclear waste in a way that was just terrible, technically and politically, the so-called Screw Nevada Act. But Sweden and Canada both seem to have pathways for nuclear waste storage that seem reasonable. There's not an objective reason for high cost or concern. I think that basically nuclear waste has become a football by people who, for other reasons, don't want nuclear power and want to block it that way. But I personally don't see the waste concern as serious at all. I do see proliferation concerns as serious. In a world where you really grow nuclear power a lot, there's no easy way that you don't make access to materials easier. And, Canada has a pretty clear track record on this. We built a CANDU reactor for a lot of good reasons, because we couldn't make big pressure vessels and we had the ability to make heavy water. But CANDU is just great for making weapons-grade plutonium, because you can drive things through the core quickly so you don't get the wrong ratio of the two plutonium isotopes. And India, of course, copied the CANDU design to make weapons. And Jason's shaking his head, so he gets
that is not quite accurate.
Which part is wrong?
India used a research reactor, not a CANDU reactor.
Yes, I know. I didn't say that. I said copied. Yes. I actually was a colleague of a guy I was a colleague of VK Arunachalam who ran the Shining Buddha project. Yeah, I think, yes. They did not actually use a CANDU. That is correct. But the core design of the tube, the tube design that allowed you to do relatively low burnups, which is what was used at the Hanford reactors as well, is what they copied. And CANDU does have that fundamental weakness. And I think there are lots of complicated branching ways this could work. And there, one because the counter argument is that people really want nuclear weapons in advanced societies, they can get them. And so in some sense, the counter argument is that nuclear power doesn't mean that a rich country can or can't get nuclear weapons. A rich country could do isotope enrichment and make nuclear weapons if it wants to pretty easily. Even probably Iran can, even while being bombed by the Americans. But I still think that a world with a lot more nuclear power is a world with somewhat higher proliferation risks. Very hard to assess whether that means we should do it or not. But I think the central challenge really is managing costs. And I don't buy Sara's argument about replacement. I mean, if you really did have a cheap, simple replacement for existing power generation, I don't think there's something inherently better about a more distributed power system. I just care about decarbonization and environmental impact. But I think we just don't know how to do it. And I think I'd really like to hear Jason's ideas about what are the either technical or institutional regulatory, whatever it would be, business changes that you need to make to actually build significant numbers of reactors at a reasonable price in the West.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear that as well. Thank you for teeing that up, David. And maybe, Jason, as an adjunct to that, you could talk about this notion of an unlearning curve, whereby each successive project gets more expensive rather than getting cheaper, is the way that it should happen with big energy infrastructure. And so nuclear is expensive. We know it's being built at much cheaper rates per kilowatt installed in China. I think the latest figure is $3,000 US per kilowatt installed. So it's not necessarily the technology, it's the way we've chosen to build it. But what has been the experience of other Western democracies in building new nuclear? Like, is it just irreconcilable with Western democracies and it's going to have that unlearning curve? Or is this, there's a better way of doing it that, in particular in North America, we've not yet discovered?
I do agree with what David said about nuclear waste being a football and being handled phenomenally poorly in the U.S. for a number of reasons. But to Sarah's point, the Achilles heel of nuclear is absolutely, it takes a long time. The time value of money makes it not make sense. There's no cheap way to do it. We don't have small modular reactors are not small. Let me be really, really clear about that. A CANDU reactor is 700 megawatts electric and change, and these small modular reactors are 300 megawatts and change. That's not actually small by, I think, any reasonable definition of small. One of the things I'm fond of saying is that people on the political left don't trust big business. People on the political right don't trust big government. And one of the problems with nuclear is you need both big business and you need big government for nuclear to work. And from the standpoint of when we are looking at wanting to decentralize electricity, nuclear is the worst possible solution. And I think that there is an emotional response to nuclear from the standpoint of it's central, it's controlled by people I don't trust. It is reasonable to not trust a number of the people who've been involved with nuclear. Nuclear has, in its history, as does a lot of other industries, but nuclear specifically has in its history, reasons to fundamentally distrust nuclear. The radium girls is an excellent example. The uranium mines through Africa were really, really atrocious from the standpoint of taking advantage of the indigenous people. Nuclear has a lot of history to answer for. And when nuclear was being built cheaper, we were doing things that we should not have done. We were doing things that were in a lot of ways atrocious. And in the unlearning, some of what we were unlearning was learning new things that got in the way of us being efficient. And being efficient can very much be the enemy of doing what's right. So when it gets down to what problem are we trying to solve, climate change is a wicked problem. In terms of it being technocratic, as defined here, I don't see nuclear necessarily being less technocratic than relying on batteries, which do have a huge waste problem. Having grid-level batteries would have a waste problem that I would feel very uncomfortable with. I was worried about solar waste for a long time, and the more I learned about it, the less worried I got about the waste from solar. It is a thing. It needs to be dealt with, but I think solar waste can be dealt with properly. Battery waste, I'm a lot less comfortable with. There is no plug-and-play solution for climate change. As far as nuclear being used in the oil sands, I think it's really important to remember that when we're talking about transportation, almost every country in the world, more than 90% of their transportation energy comes from oil. Exceptions are places in South America. I know Brazil has a strong ethanol, but transportation is largely oil, and oil is not extensively used for electricity. There's been a big push with EVs to try and unify those. I am personally, however, very opposed to nuclear in the oil sands for reasons that are probably beyond the scope of what we're going to have time to talk about. But I can understand where there is the difference between what we're doing with electricity and what we're doing with transportation. With oil, I think it's really important to remember that what oil has been used for recently is not a lot with electricity. In terms of will nuclear ever be effective and affordable, the refurbishments that happened at Darlington were done way ahead of schedule and under budget. And this was something that the nuclear industry got really, really proud of. But the difficulty is the story out there about nuclear is all about, cost overruns. And a lot of the cost overruns have been political. The nuclear reactors that were built in the 80s in Ontario went way over budget, in part because an anti-nuclear NDP government came in during the 1980s, halted construction. So you had all of this startup, and then everything got halted, and people were still paying interest on the original loans, and that drives up price. So the entire nuclear industry at the moment is watching what's happening in Ontario with the first of a kind cost. And I am almost willing to guarantee that the first nuclear reactor built of this BWRX that's happening at the Darlington site in Ontario, I'm almost willing to guarantee it will go over budget. However, the question is what happens with the second one? And I think Ontario at the moment is making the very calculated risk for the reward of, if they're right and the BWRX is a big reactor in the future, they will have a workforce that is prepared to go and deploy 1,000 of these. If they're wrong and they can't get this right, then I don't know that nuclear does have much of a future. So there's an awful lot riding on this, because I agree, nuclear needs to be cheap enough.
The workforce benefits, it's something that you see really trumpeted in Ontario. In fact, there's a Protect Ontario ad that has Doug Ford sort of saber rattling toward the U.S. and saying he's going to protect Ontario, and nuclear actually features in that. And just as one anecdote, and I'd love to get to a little bit to Western Canada. If you look at the Saskatchewan NDP that released its energy policy recently, it talked a lot about nuclear and the job creation benefits. In Alberta here, it had one small passing reference and was largely negatively framed. So this is something that it's nuclear power and the economic impact or economic benefits, much more part of the furniture in Ontario, in the same way that oil and gas here in Alberta is part of the furniture. But sorry, Sarah, you've got a comment on cost.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to throw in one more. I mean, there's a sort of, I guess, somewhat well-known paper back from 2020 looking at sources of cost overrun in nuclear power plant by coming out of Jessica Transik's group. It's part of a broader body of research. Jason, I'm sure you can comment on it too, looking at costs. And it certainly...
Is that the one looking at France?
This one is US, I think.
Okay.
But it certainly talks about, the safety related factors, and the fact that we're, doing some things better raises cost. I think also my impression, and again, correct me if I'm wrong here, but a big part of the cost of the nuclear plant are really the labor costs and the construction costs. And so there's also some underlying, economic differences when we talk about the cost of doing this in China versus the cost of doing this in Canada. I don't think you're ever going to find, nor do we probably want people to find, workers in Canada that are willing to build these plants for the same wages that they are paid in China to build these plants too. So just to throw that in there in this sort of general question of like, well, why can China do this so cheaply? I think that there is that element of, part of what's making solar inexpensive is that we're able to outsource, if you want, a lot of the construction costs, which are the manufacturing, really fundamentally, of the panels, to lower cost countries.
The cost issue we know is crucial. And I say this, just yesterday I had a conversation with two people from the think tank Clean Prosperity. They commissioned some polling, and what they found is 52% of Canadians in their poll think that nuclear will be part of the energy future for Canada, but only 5% are willing to pay for nuclear if that's going to trigger rising costs in their energy bill. So it's a huge disconnect. We want it, but not if we have to pay more for it. And there is that impression that there isn't a lid on nuclear costs. David, I know you want to jump in about land footprint.
Yeah, I want to say one of the fundamental things I really am excited about nuclear, that to me is one of the long run reasons I really want to see nuclear developed, which is, any energy source has environmental impacts. And one of the irreducible environmental impacts is land footprint. And nuclear power is as good as it gets on that source. So to give you a sense of it, wind power, if you want to supply a substantial fraction of the world's energy source by wind power, you're really talking about having environmental impacts over a significant fraction of the world's land, like 10%. For solar power, that number's more like 1%. That is, real solar productivity is about 10 watts per square meter on average. And so if you time doing 10 terawatts, you're talking about 1% of the land area, but that's not nothing. It starts to be real environmental impacts as it grows. And nuclear is much better by an order of magnitude or more, even when you count the whole footprint, including the mining and the waste. And so I think that's a kind of fundamental thing I like about nuclear power. Important to say some positives.
I want to address some of the things that Sara said about China. One of the things that we're going to see is that the wages in China are going to go up. This is one of the things that happened when Romania joined my family's from Romania. And when Romania joined the European Union, it wound up, flooding the market with, there's lots of cheap labor. And then that rises everything in Romania. And then, other countries wind up coming in. So part of what China's trying to do is it's trying to modernize its economy. I do think that the people in China who are doing these constructions, 25 years from now, will be making 10 times as much money. You're right. We're not going to be able to get construction costs like that now. And neither will China when we're 25 years in the future, if everything goes right. If everything goes wrong, if they're still getting paid the same amount in 25 years, then that's going to be a real catastrophe.
We're going to take some questions now from the audience, maybe 2 or 3, I think is all we have time for. And getting back to waste, we know, and David, you referenced it, the U.S. basically spent decades trying to build a permanent nuclear waste site. I don't know if it's Yucca Mountain. They got deep into it, and then politics killed it, and now they've got no long-term solution. The waste sitting all over the place. So that's the bad case. David, you'd mentioned that Canada and Sweden are doing a better job. Erwin Dreesen asked, how is France dealing with its nuclear waste? Jason?
There are 31 countries in the world that have nuclear power, compared to roughly a dozen have nuclear weapons, just big round numbers. All 31 countries that have nuclear power are at some stage of, we are going to dig a deep hole in a stable geologic formation and put our waste there permanently. So all 31 countries have come to that same conclusion. Canada has especially good geology for this. What France has done that's a little different from some of the other countries is that France has done a fair amount of reprocessing of their fuel. I have a nuclear fuel bundle here. It's empty. When you send this through a nuclear reactor, the uranium in here, it starts all uranium, and then only a small fraction of it actually winds up undergoing that fission. Some of it winds up getting turned into plutonium. Some of it winds up being fissioned apart, but most of it actually stays uranium. The French, and they're not the only country in the world that do this, reprocess, and they actually take that plutonium out to put it into what's called a multi-oxide fuel, MOX fuel, MOX, that can then go through again. But all nuclear power still requires some long-term solution for where this, which is going to be very radioactive, can become less radioactive over time, which is, the time is usually quoted at 1 million years. And I think that's a reasonable number to use. So that's what France is doing, is that they are in the process of looking for a geologically suitable place. Also, all 31 countries have decided, and it's very clear across all the countries that have nuclear power, they want to bury their nuclear waste in their own land. France does not want to ship their nuclear waste to Canada, for example. Despite the fact that we have great geology, the politics of that are just a non-starter.
I think we have time for, well, maybe we'll squeeze in 2, but I'm going to go to James Van Leeuwen and read his question. I share Sara's concern about technocrats employing fission power as a stalling tactic, but I expect the nuclear chickens will come home to roost a lot sooner than the technocrats expect. Given the costs and risk issues with fission power, is there a legitimate case for investing in fission power rather than solar plus wind plus geothermal plus BESS?
Maybe I can be a little more generous towards nuclear on this and say that, it's exactly my concern with the sort of crowding out or the use of nuclear as a delay tactic. So, if there was a plan to say, take Alberta, for example. There was a plan to say, let's both invest in building out nuclear and invest in building out more wind and solar and all of these things. Like if there could really be a political momentum towards that, then, the part of me that says, well, let's throw a lot of things at the wall when it comes to trying to decarbonize our sources of electricity and electrify more things. There is a cost element that comes in. To me, that feels less worrisome from nuclear being a delay. It's really when people come with nuclear and say, well, no, let's not do this other stuff. Let's do nuclear instead, that I think the alarm bells should ring about what's really the underlying motive here. And it's a subtle difference, right? And so I think that is, it makes it tricky to kind of sometimes unpack.
China, of course, really is doing both. So, it's clearly possible to do both. I think the answer is that there are good reasons to invest in nuclear long run. The kind of compactness and environmental footprint is a good reason. The problem is how we figure out how to do it at a reasonable cost.
I've got a question that builds upon that, and I think this will be the last question that we can take. It's from Rob Tremblay, and I'll paraphrase it. Rob got lots of time on the mic in our last episode. If you haven't heard the Turning the Tables episode, check it out. To summarize, it's asking about the economics of nuclear. Are the economics of nuclear even more tough in the electricity mixes of today than they were 50 years ago? And maybe this is the way we bring it back to Alberta. So Alberta doesn't have a crown utility. It's unlike Ontario or Quebec or New Brunswick. It has an energy-only market. Jason, is that going to limit the potential of nuclear being used in Alberta just because the market structure doesn't work for it?
Yes, and I feel a little funny answering this question because one of the students you have working to help form this did his senior thesis with me on this very process. So I want to give a shout out to Michael Edmonds and his senior thesis. The answer is yeah. When you have state-owned utilities, it's a lot easier to get nuclear or hydro, for that matter, off the ground, up and running, because companies are really, really allergic to waiting that long for the return on investment. I also share Sarah's concern. I'm very pro-nuclear. However, I'm very, very much opposed to let's wait until we can get nuclear on the grid to start acting on climate change. The time to act on climate change was 40 years ago, and we can't do that. So we need to be doing as much as we can right now. When we have something like an energy-only market, which for listeners here, what that means is that different electricity providers come to the table and say, I can produce electricity for this amount of money right now. And then they go into a bidding system, and then whatever is cheapest gets in at the moment is a quick overview of that. And nuclear does not do well in that kind of market. Nuclear wants to get a very, very definite, this is how much we are going to get paid, so they can take the risk of prices going up and down off the table. Natural gas, which is where Alberta gets most of its electricity from, does really, really well in an environment that allows the market to go all over the place. Alberta has very expensive electricity compared to the rest of Canada, compared to places like Ontario, where 60% of the grid is nuclear. Quebec, which did not get mentioned previously, but Quebec did actually have 2 nuclear reactors that got shut down. Hydro was simply cheaper. Natural gas was simply cheaper. And when it comes to energy versus climate, there's a cost aspect of, we have been, fossil fuels are great, but what do you do with the waste? You breathe it in, you let it change the climate. We've got to do a lot to change that. And to Sarah's point, we cannot afford to waste. We cannot afford to kick the can down the road. And this will be expensive. This will unquestionably be expensive, which is unfortunate because people got used to paying cheap. But whether we're talking about electricity or even just transport, I love bicycling, but I like having the convenience of a car. That's coming to a close. And that's what climate change is really doing for us, is it's making things a whole lot less convenient. It will be expensive. And when we have things like the energy only market in Alberta, it is very, very difficult to do things like nuclear power. Or I'm actually inclined to think it would also hit things like geothermal. But we'll see what winds up happening.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, there's definitely ways to keep those costs lower, but you're absolutely right that in Alberta's competitive market, it's something like nuclear and even something new like geothermal is not going to happen without some kind of intervention from the government. And, there's ways, again, to do that well and poorly, right? So if government is taking the risk, they should be also getting some of that upside. So that's another thing that I would certainly be looking for in the way that those contracts are structured, right? There are sort of good ways to provide government support and there are bad ways, and we should do it in the good way.
But the energy only market really favors the short term, and in terms of build it up quickly, get it out, and even with the coal-fired power plants, Alberta is notorious for running its coal-fired power plants in a very short term, run it into the ground. Where if they actually maintain things properly, the coal-fired power plants would last a lot longer and require a lot less intervention.
Thanks, Jason. This was terrific. Nuclear sits at the intersection of, engineering and economic realities. We know that technically we can build it. Economically, it's hard. Institutionally, it's incredibly hard, especially in places like here in Canada. But you were very helpful in helping us to unpack that today, and we're grateful. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to Energy versus Climate. The show is created by David Keith, Sara Hastings-Simon, and me, Ed Whittingham, and produced by Emmett Tandon with help from Michael Edmonds. Our title and show music is The Wind Up by Brian Lips. This season of Energy versus Climate is produced with the support of the North Family Foundation, the Conscon Foundation, the Trottier Family Foundation, and you, our generous listeners. Sign up for updates and exclusive webinar access at energyversusclimate.com and review and rate us on your favorite podcast platform. If you enjoyed this episode, check out our earlier nuclear debate from Season 1, Episode 10 with MP and Green Party of Canada leader Elizabeth May. During that show, we tackled many of the same questions, but from a very different perspective. We'll be back on May 5th with a new show featuring Vijay Vaitheswaran of The Economist. We'll dig into how the latest global energy shock is playing out across regions, what it means for demand and policy, and whether peak fossil and peak emissions are actually in sight or still well over the horizon. See you then.